which is on a topic that is probably near and dear to many of our hearts right now, which is working from home. Something we may not have realized we would be dealing with, but here we all are. So, couple of housekeeping notes just before we get started. I wanted to give you a heads up that we have more of these great webinars coming up. Next week's webinar is going to be on epilepsy medications and COVID-19, including a live Q&A through our Facebook Live account with Dr. Berkovici and pharmacist Laura Wang. So be sure to tune in for that. That's going to be next Thursday at 2 p.m. And also we have a whole lot of employment workshops coming up. They will all be online. They won't be through Facebook Live. They'll be through our Zoom account at Epilepsy Toronto. So to get involved in more of those, you can check out our website for our updated calendar of events, which has all those workshops listed. And you can get in touch with our employment specialist, Jessie Preston, who I'm about to introduce, who's one of our speakers today. So Jessie, can you join me? Jessie Preston, who is a job development and job retention specialist here at Epilepsy Toronto, here being not my house, but our office. Hello, Jessie, good morning. Hello, good afternoon, what are we at?
Well, we're about a minute after, so afternoon.
Afternoon. Good afternoon, Jessie. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Also on our panel today, we have longtime Epilepsy Toronto client and member and occasional staff member, Lindsay Yeo, who has worked from home for over 8 years and has lots of expertise in this subject. So Lindsay, are you there? Oh, there she is from her home office.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Great, thank you both for joining us. So the way this is going to work is we're gonna do a little bit of a presentation off the top. Jessie's gonna lead that with Lindsay's help, and then we're gonna open it up for a Q&A. So as the presentation is going on, if you have any questions, there's a place in the Facebook live stream where you at the bottom you can type in your questions. We're gonna be monitoring that for questions for the Q&A afterwards. So put them in there and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. And you know, this is a field that almost everyone is an expert in and no one's an expert in at the moment. We're all dealing with it. So you might even have some ideas that you want to put out there, and we might be reading out some of those too. So if you have some great suggestions, things that you've tried that have worked out, add them to the comments too. Even if we don't talk about them live in the stream, people can go back there and check them out anytime. So we want your feedback. This is a bit more of an interactive session than usual. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it to you, Jessie, and let you take it over.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie. So just to kind of start, I know we talked, we talked a little bit about, or Mackenzie made mention of the fact that, some of us aren't expert in it, and, but we're also not an expert in it. And what I'd like to think of it as is, it's kind of like a puzzle where we don't all have all the pieces. And, I have a few pieces, you guys have a few pieces. So all together we can work together to put this puzzle together and help each other out a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to go to our PowerPoint. So, the acronym that I put together for working from home is the acronym SWOT, just because it just happened to lend itself to that. And that the acronym stands for Structure, Workplace, Accountability, and Technology. Now, when we're talking about structure, there's a basic rhythm that we go through when we're doing things like getting ready for work, going to work. Most of us have a commute that's longer because we have to travel to work. So, and these are things that are already as part of our normal routine already. So, there's a number of things that we can do to make adjustments to that. And I guess here's where I'd like to bring in Lindsay, and we can talk a little bit about some routines that maybe she's had or she's seen other people have that are part of our everyday routine that can be used for things like work from home. Lindsay?
Sure. I know for me, I find that, having kind of a similar routine to what I'm doing when I'm at work, when I'm going into an office is really helpful. So if I'm getting up and having a shower every day and putting on something other than pajamas, even if it's still comfy clothes, but to work from home, it's still maybe not my, you know, my just putting my PJs on and rolling out of bed and hanging out on my computer all day. Sort of getting into a routine, you know, making my breakfast, that kind of stuff. So I find that that's really helpful just to get me into a different mindset as I'm starting my day.
You know, in preparing for this, when listening to some stories, one that kind of struck me was a person who got dressed, had their breakfast, took their coffee with them to go, walked around the block, and came back in as though their house was just a new place to work. And I think that's very interesting because they even included their commute in their normal routine and rhythm, which I found fascinating. A suggestion that I have is, of course, use an existing routine if you can, like what I just said about the person who actually decided to build in some commute time, you know, things like exercising, you know, just something to fill in that extra gap. So scheduling with work, you know, so a good place to start is, I know that some people have difficulties with the transition because the structure from the workplace is missing. You know, you do things at a very particular time, people have specific demands, you do certain activities at a certain time, and these things are sometimes defined by our boss, which we might not be able to do anymore. We have a little bit more freedom with that. So part of this, of course, is to break your workday down into working blocks where you can do specific tasks in specific times. So basically, you're redefining that structure. Along with doing that for your time, you're also doing that with your tasks. So every task that you have has different working blocks to it. So you can break something down from, say you have to do a report, you know, you can do research on the report, then you actually do a draft of the report, then you write up the report, you know, and then you have it edited and so forth. So these are different blocks. So you can actually break that down. And then in between blocks, you want to create some transition time. So some people have difficulties with switching from one task to the other. And in technical terms, we call this an executive function, which is shifting attention. And, you know, so it's important to note that we need, as human beings, time to shift from one activity to the other. And we do this naturally when we're working. So say someone was going to school, for example, and they're switching times and they have recess. Well, recess is 15 minutes long. In that time, you're mentally shifting from one activity to the other. Or when we're talking about things like college or university, you know, you're walking from one class to another. You're, again, mentally shifting from one to the other. And same thing with work breaks at work, etc. So the lesson behind that is don't schedule back to back and have a little bit more time than you need. And I want to bring Lindsay in on this because we talked extensively about this before. So Lindsay? I know something that I actually happened to read online from, I mean, so many people are talking about the working from home lifestyle right now and trying to figure out their structure. So ironically, something that I actually had seen that was really interesting to me was regarding kids and trying to have a structure that fit with your kids' days so that, you know, if they're having recess, you're taking a break from work. If they're having your lunch, you're having your lunch with them. So it gives you a little bit of time with them while you're all kind of at home, but also trying to give you still a little bit of a routine feeling. I don't know if that works. I'm not someone who can test that out, but definitely intriguing that people are putting this to a test right now. And I'm sure it works for some and maybe not all, but it just sounded really cool. Well, and I thank you for that tidbit of advice. When we first started talking about putting together a workshop like this, I actually did have the opportunity to try it out. And a good thing was that it was my son that actually commented it. Alex said, "This was the best day ever." And I asked him why, and he said it's because we get to have lunch as a family, and we don't get to do that when you go to work downtown. And that was kind of a special dad moment for me, you know, to kind of hear that. So, even with all the changes that have been going on and the new structure and all the chaos, you know, there really are some silver linings in this, and that just happened to be one of them.
And maybe that can help you find a new normal in this crazy time.
Maybe.
Not every day, but.
Yeah, unfortunately, my kids aren't in school proper yet, so we didn't call it recess. We called it snack and break and stuff like that. You know, and again, structuring time around things. So if you have things like sensitive meetings and stuff like that, or webinars like this, it's good to try and have a plan of, you know, what activities are they going to be doing if someone's able to watch them, so that you can have that time isolated to deal with things that are maybe more sensitive, or that require fewer disruptions. So earlier I spoke about chunking out tasks. So here's an example of a online presentation. And as you can see, the assignment is online presentation, similar to this webinar. Well, there's certain tasks that are involved in that. And things like creating the PowerPoint, getting your audience, and then facilitation of the PowerPoint. You can have different steps throughout that. So researching content, actually creating the PowerPoint, putting some design or branding into it, and then the editing phase and so forth, getting another person to look at it. So as you can see, even when you have an assignment, then you have a sub-level of tasks, and then you have a sub-level of steps that sort of follow into that. So when we're talking about chunking out tasks, we're talking about assigning steps to slots of time, and that helps bring with productivity. Examples of transition tasks. So, you know, earlier we spoke about things like, you know, getting up and going out for the day. But again, we've also talked about transitions in terms of coffee breaks and so forth between those slotted times. And again, that might be something as having snack with kids, or going for lunch, or a coffee break, or even, you know, doing some activities of self-care, things like stretching and exercising and those sorts of things. At the end, it's good to have a routine that breaks you out of work. So I know that some people get into the zone when they're working, and they can work for hours and so forth. And, you know, it's important to have a ritual at the end of work to break you out of that. It could be something like cooking dinner. It could be time with kids. It could be taking the dog, or well, not, you don't take cats for a walk, but taking the dog for a walk. You know, so have some of those activities to mentally decompress and break you out of that workflow. So earlier we spoke about scheduling and children and so forth. So a really good activity, and I got this one from How to ADHD, how to make a stay-at-home plan during a crisis. Really good video. I recommend that everybody sees it. It's good for people with ADHD and people that don't have ADHD. But what I really liked about it was this exercise where you can actually plan the day with your kids using cue cards and stuff like that. And I started doing that with the kids. It worked really well. They seem to all want to put the stuff that requires screens all together, but you know, we've managed to negotiate and break that up. And you know, the ability to plan with children is a very important skill, and them being able to do activities, children being able to play by themselves and do activities by themselves, are also important skills. So even fostering that independence at this time is really useful. So, and then you can do things with them like, why don't we schedule our recess or our break or our lunch? And this is what my workday looks like, so that they have an idea of what you're doing as well. Workspace. So this is the W in SWOT. And it talks about workspace versus home space, communication with other people in the house that you're working, as well as managing distractions. So when you're considering a workspace, there's a number of things that you want to do. It's not just about having a physical space, but it's also about the mental separation in your mind that this is, I'm at work or I'm at home. So of course, the first thing to recommend is have a dedicated office space if you can. I know a lot of people out there can't do that. I'm certainly one of them. I'm doing this from one of the rooms in the house, but when I first started to do this, I was actually balancing my laptop on top of boxes during webinars and so forth, because I didn't have a desk. Fortunately, someone gave me a desk a little bit later, but I didn't have a desk, so I operated with what I could. But that's what I had to do at that particular time when we started this transition. So again, desk, coffee table works best. If you can't do that kind of segregation, then do something else that makes the space different or the activity different. So a good suggestion I've heard is maybe have a different mouse, have a different login for your computer. Go to a specific room during a specific time. So there's ways to make that sort of mental segregation of this is home and this is work. Also from How to ADHD, this was a really interesting strategy on things like communication and talking to people, just communicating with other people in your house that you're working, and it's okay or not to disturb you. Of course, the classic do not disturb sign works well. But a strategy that they were talking about was something a little bit more visual, which was this cup method. And have green, yellow, and red. And basically do not disturb. Only if it's important, you can pester me. And you can come up and bother me. I'm distractible. So there's that communication element as well. I wish to note for the record that sometimes this works well with kids. So earlier when I was doing the method, I said to my daughter, I said, "What color is this?" And she's like, "Red." And I said, "Does that mean do not disturb?" She said, "Yes." So she walked over, picked it up and did this and said, "Now you're available." So occasionally, it works, but you also have to have people all on board with it as well. So as a person with ADHD, distraction is the bane of my existence. And the thing is that your home is filled with distractions. And they're distractions sometimes that you create because this is your home, you do these activities, you want to have your own particular space. So the question is what is distracting for you? Is it visual? Is it auditory? And are there ways to remove it or reduce it? What distracts you is the real question here. So I'm going to flip this over to Lindsay for a minute. We're going to talk about distraction.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest distractions looking back to my time working from home full time. So I would have two computers. I had a work computer and I had a laptop, but I would have my laptop beside me a lot of times while I was working. So even though I was working on my work stuff, it was a very easy glance over and, oh, what's new on Facebook? Or, oh, let me check my phone for this text message. So I think it's easy to have things around you that distract you. So now what is much preferable to me would be to have those in another room, because those are a great excuse to get up and walk away from my desk too. So it's actually a good excuse. Well, I need a break. Oh, let me just go and have a look at this. Or, oh, I think so-and-so needed to text. I can do that when I'm having lunch. So I think there are ways that you can reduce some of those. Now, yes, you may need your phone, you may need some of those things, but what else can you do to start to minimize so that you can focus a little bit better and get a little less distracted? What does music work? Does it not? Can you hear neighbors in a condo building? I sometimes hear my neighbors, so maybe headphones are better. Some days they're not. It's trying to figure out what works, and it'll be different on different days for sure.
Mm-hmm. Oddly enough, I don't know if you've ever had this this issue, but sometimes I find I'm actually distracted by work itself. So, there's times when I'm supposed to be working and I can be distracted by things that aren't work related. But there's also times when I'm supposed to be not working and I'm distracted by work at the same time. So I don't know if you've had that experience, but there's times when I've had that experience.
I know a coworker I used to work with, and I was always amazed by this. He was very well set in his routine for the day. So he would check into his email first thing in the day and respond to emails, and then he would do it at the end of the day, and he would have stuff scheduled for the rest of the afternoon. I'm someone who would always be looking at email. Partly that was my job in customer service, but to do that, I always thought it was so amazing that you would just be so focused at, this is the only time I'm looking at these things, and then you're less distracted by them. To minimize, or maybe you just go on do not disturb if you're in group chat rooms for work. Maybe there are different ways that those can be done now. I know in the past when I was doing it, it was something that I don't think I got really good at, but I think now I would try to make that a better focus, because they were for sure distracting. You want to know what's going on every second.
Yeah. And a good place to start with this is make a list of what you're distracted by. Do it just distraction audit. I don't know if that's a word or term. We're coining this term now, but do a distraction audit. And every time you get distracted, write down what was distracting, and then take a look at it later and see what kind of themes there are, involved in that. Accountability. So results based work environment versus things that are priority, as well as documenting your activities, and then ultimately accountability. So there was a really good, it is a YouTube video, but it's also a TED Talk. It was by a gentleman by the name of Dan Pink, and he did a video on the puzzle of motivation. And he talked about things like the candle problem, as well as results-based work versus time-based work. So before, there used to be a lot of emphasis on, you're working for me, this is the company time, was the standard of work before. But even over the last couple of decades, that's been shifting to more deliverable-based work. So we want you to accomplish this in a specific amount of time, or we have this particular problem, we just need a solution. So in his video, he refers to something called results only work environment, the ROW. He also talks about things like Google's 20% time and so forth. So these were some of the more human resources type philosophies that were just starting to come out, and he's speaking about it obviously during his TED Talk. It's a really interesting video to take a look at. And I think that from work from home perspective, employers used to object, well, how do I know if they're working? How do I know if they're doing X, Y, and Z? So this is now a good opportunity to do that mental shift. And I think many employers are going through this shift right now, where it's not so much about the time that's being put in as much as it is about accomplishing tasks. Time is always important, but getting the work done is more important. What the workload is and so forth, accomplishing that is becoming more important as time goes on. So, and there's a number of things that are good. So have that conversation with your boss. What is a reasonable amount of work, bearing in mind your situation? Is it really realistic to do everything that you used to do, with the fact that you have maybe kids at home or a partner who's on a different schedule? So it's a good idea to have that open conversation with your employer. And if you're the employer, partly because I do this, I've been thinking about doing this presentation for employers and so forth, and you don't have anyone to report to, you can always do things like get an accountability partner, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. Set reasonable metrics, so what's the indicators of if you're doing a good job or if you're accomplishing things. And, there's always going to be setbacks, computer's going to go wrong, the internet crash, there's all kinds of things that could be a disruption. The fire alarms go off, because you can't really control many of those things. So it's important to make adjustments as time goes on. This is one of my favorite tools, and I'm giving a shout out to How to ADHD. It's called the priority matrix. And you basically make a grid, and you take your tasks and you segregate them into these 4 categories. So there are tasks that are important and urgent, and there are tasks that are not important, but they're urgent. And then there are things that are not urgent, but they are important. And there are things that are not important and not urgent. And things that are urgent but not important are things like Facebook, checking Facebook, some of those things that are distraction. They don't really add necessarily to your work, but you have this urge to go and watch them and do these things. I would say that most tasks fall within the area of not urgent, but important. So things like a book that you've always wanted to write, or you've always wanted to learn guitar, or you've always wanted to do an activity, for example. These things aren't urgent. No one's making you do them, but they're important to you. So, I would, when you're thinking about which tasks they're doing, you want to focus more on ones that are important and less on the ones that aren't important, even if they're urgent. Of course, you have to do the ones that are important and urgent first, but so this is a great tool for figuring that out. When we're talking about activities, again, employers may want to know, what have you done with this time that you're at home? So it's important to do things like document. The little chart below, it talks about week, activity, and completed. This is actually how we're currently documenting our stuff. What week are we doing this work in? What task were we doing, or what activity did we do? And where does it currently stand? And you can actually then see this roll out week to week to week to week to week in our communication. So you actually know how productive you are. And then you can take a look and reflect back on that and go, when we're planning further ahead and we're going to do certain activities, have we been able to do that before? Is it realistic? It could also be something as simple as a to-do list. And at the end of the day, the communication here is it doesn't have to be complex. It just has to, it has to work. And particularly in a situation like now, things that work are going to be a little bit more, you want things that people can easily run with. And that's going to be more important now than something that does everything. So I mentioned earlier accountability partners, and this is a concept that that people have been talking about. I've heard about it from people who've been to AA, and one of the things that basically you're creating your own peer pressure, and it's someone that you can check in with and see, did you accomplish what you set out to accomplish, and it's giving that outsider perspective on your situation, and it helps with things like compliance and so forth. So it works well in things like support groups and Alcoholics Anonymous, when someone needs to call someone, say they want to go for, they're thinking about having drinks or so forth, and they just need someone to talk to them. That works well in a work environment. If you're sitting there and promising someone all the time, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then you constantly come back and say, well, I didn't get it done, you're going to feel that peer pressure to change your behavior and so forth. So a good accountability partner is not your boss, because your boss has legitimate power. You want someone who doesn't have legitimate power, because it's about peer pressure. It's not about legitimate consequences, because that's already there. So you want that extra pressure with that. And there's many industries that deploy this technique. So Lindsay and me were talking about this earlier, about which industry was it? Personal training. So Lindsay, I actually don't know. I know a little bit about personal training, but I think you know quite a bit more than I do. So I'm gonna flip that over to you to just comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think thinking back about this a little bit over the weekend, and I was just realizing there's a ton of things that I now am looking and kind of trying to be accountable for. And some of it I'm just checking in with myself, mostly because apps and a lot of the things that are out there now help me to follow and see what I'm doing. So I can see if I'm getting enough sleep. I can also check how much water I'm drinking based on some stuff that's being created. I can, there's just so many things I can mark down that I'm doing workouts or that I'm walking every day, just so that I can remember that I'm getting out every day. It's almost like I can check off my list. So I do follow things on apps, but at the same time, I have to-do lists and I can check things off on my to-do list. So it's trying to find what are the things that that work for you personally. Sometimes talking to people doesn't help. I do check in with friends, but if those things don't help for some things, what will help you in getting what you need? There's just so many options out there these days that I think, you know, you just have a lot of variety. So you just have to kind of start testing things out and see what works.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I have someone that I check in with every week, and I kind of, one of the things I say is, this is what I'm going to do this week. This is what I did last week. And this is what I did last week. This is what I'm going to do this week. And here are some of the problems that I'm anticipating this week. Here's what I'm thinking of, you know, and then you can have this conversation and have an objective point of view on whether or not this is a good idea or if it's going to work or not. Technology. So this is the last T in this is the last letter in the acronym SWOT. So T, and it's a checklist. Woohoo! Basically, it's, you know, what technology do you require to work at home? What functionality do you need out of it? Do you need a computer, or do you do it over phone, headset, etc.? Do you need printer and fax? You know, I know that some companies that have a lot of security, you know, maybe they need like a particular mainframe that you log into, so there's softwares involved, antiviruses and so forth. And even just right now doing this talk, you know, I need a webcam, for example, to be able to do this. So, you know, it's important to just take a look at kind of what are you planning on doing and what are some of the technology needs that you require, and even just creating a simple checklist for that. So here's a slide on video conferencing, for example. And, you know, a great analogy that when we were figuring this all out, that was used is, think of it as kind of like a movie shoot, and you're the star. So you want to think about things like lighting and what your background's going to be, or the set. You know, do you have good posture? When you're talking, is the middle of your face kind of in the central part? I was on a conference call this morning, and someone was talking like this. Hello, thank you for coming to the meeting today. You know, and of course, you know, things like your background are give and take, because depending on what you can actually do for your background.
So I love this little part of the discussion, because so in my background, there's mirrors. They're the only mirrors I have in my condo, and I love them, but they're also very distracting behind me. I know when I used to be on meetings all the time, it was years. Some coworkers, it took them years meeting with me to realize that that was actually my own home. They for the longest time would say, "Oh my gosh, I totally thought someone was working behind you," and we would just have a good laugh about it, and I'd say, "No, like, it's just," so we'd have a good laugh about it, but it can be, I know it can be distracting. And we had a big debate on whether or not I needed to put in one of those fun virtual backgrounds that you can do, but those are also a little bit tricky, because how do you make sure those are not distracting in and of themselves? So it's a challenge.
Yeah, I like that. And when we first started to talk about that, the first thing I'm just like, oh, you're in the office. You know, because I looked behind you and I saw a body and I saw a computer desk and I saw the computer. So I actually thought you were in an office originally when we started talking about work from home, because I hadn't done a video conferencing with you because we always met. So that was kind of a surprise for me initially. And then you're like, no, it's a mirror. And then I kind of was like, okay, she's wearing an Epilepsy Toronto shirt. I can see the Epilepsy Toronto logo on the other person's back. Okay, yeah. So, but yeah, and one of the things that I had to learn very quickly is that depending on, you know, where your workspace is it might be confined from things like how strong your Wi-Fi signal is, or are you using a LAN network, for example. So the actual physical location might dictate where you work and so forth. So just a note on children, to kind of end this off. So as a father, you know, there's a lot of things that I had to do from the beginning with things like set boundaries And I actually got a lot of support from teachers and so forth. And one of the things they said to me is encourage the children to be independent in their play and their activities. This is an important skill for them when they grow up. Provide the structure, but also give them a say on the structure. We talked about that activity earlier. Have the same working blocks, same transition times if you can, and so forth. So these are all things that you can do with kids to help with your structure in moving forward. And inevitably this happens. And I love this video. So this is from the BBC News. And you may have seen this on Facebook or on Twitter. It was everywhere for a while. So this gentleman who is a professor, I've forgotten his name just off the top. It's a great video to watch, so watch it. He was having a very serious conversation with the BBC, and his children invaded and stole the show. And it was fun. It was fun to watch. They then did an exclusive afterwards where I got to introduce the whole family. And I think that's a really, really unique and fun way that it was handled, to actually even just write a story on the fact that this happened. Even though it was an embarrassing moment, it actually turned into something really cool. And I think I saw a recent video where people are actually talking to him about advice from work from home when you have a family. So he's even become an expert out of it. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think I've had the webinars that I've done so far since this has happened. I've had my dog on screen. I know my daughter Chloe has photo bombed once or twice, and it will happen even though you try your best to schedule things around it. And some meetings, you know, when they're not important, you know, there's always your confidential meetings, but you know, so sometimes this will happen. So, and I think from that, we're just going to turn it over to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Jesse and Lindsay. You can both join me again here. Yeah, we've had some great comments on our Facebook feed as well. Lindsay, are you there?
Yes.
There we go.
There she is.
So shout out to the folks who are making suggestions. We've got some great suggestions from Grant Lowe about using a Google Calendar for time.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Lifesaver.
Yep.
Lifesaver.
I agree.
Yes, I agree too. And creating deadlines to beat the distraction. That's part of the way. If you have specific deadlines, I think that's another helps with the Google Calendar. And Stephanie Tate, also some great suggestions. One I really liked was to decrease visual and sound distractions. Basically declutter your space. Like make sure that what's in your space.
Decluttering, yeah, that's a good one. That's definitely good.
Like that idea.
I did a little bit of that, I'll be honest, yeah. And she also recommends noise canceling headphones, which I can imagine if you've got the family around, that could be very helpful.
Well, and when you have like a headphone and mic on, so even if you're having a more, say you're listening to something that's confidential, you know, what you're saying might not be confidential, but maybe what you're hearing is confidential, for example. So someone might be telling you where they're kind of at. And if you're giving suggestions on things like self-care and all that, these things might not necessarily be confidential to anyone who's listening. So what you're saying versus what you're hearing, you might be hearing something confidential, but not necessarily saying something confidential. And it's always good, you know, if you're on a confidential call or someone to say, I'm going to be using this particular thing. I do have kids at home. So there may be an interruption. If there's an interruption, I'm going to say I'm being interrupted, or I'm going to ask you to stop. So just having that conversation at the beginning of the call can really help with that.
Setting expectations kind of thing.
Exactly. Because, you know, they should, you know, the other person is, because then the other person then has an idea of what they can disclose, you know, so they may not disclose things that are super confidential at the time of that call. Or they might say, you think we can schedule a time to have a more in-depth call when you're not going to have those distractions. So there's times when I've been able to go for a walk, you know, and then I know the distraction's not there and have the conversation over the phone. So there's workarounds.
Great. So we do have a question from Isabel about if you're being given different tasks all at once, how do you mentally prepare for that so that you are not feeling overwhelmed?
So the first thing, I don't know if Lindsay, you want to weigh in on that first. I've got some suggestions.
It sounds overwhelming just hearing it, but I totally can relate to that feeling. It's kind of, I think, again, it's kind of knowing your priorities. So which one do you need to do for it? Kind of goes back to what you were showing us, Jesse, with the urgent and important and all of that stuff, and trying to figure out where things fit in those categories to know when, how to balance that, and then just trying to chunk it and get some breaks. For me.
Yeah, so there is those two tools. Another one that I'm kind of thinking of is, when it's a bunch of assignments all at once, setting a calendars, what is due at a particular time. So getting an understanding of a timeline of when, if things are due sooner, you might want to focus more on that. And if there's things that you can put off, you can. I remember when this all happened, we kind of went, what do we do? We have to cancel everything, and where do we pick up, and how do we do this, and can we do these things, and what about the clients, and what about the employers, and what about, so it was a lot of what about. So there was a lot of things that, and some things dictated priorities that were urgent and important, going back to the priority matrix. And some things, we kind of sat there and said, well, we need to get this done, but these two things need to be done first. So even I would recommend just setting some time aside to go through and kind of explore what's involved in a particular task, and see, is there a particular order that makes sense? And sometimes having that good old accountability partner, or even a discussion with your boss to kind of see, I'm trying to structure this. What do we think is important here, and how can we execute it? So just even having that conversation about what makes sense, that can even put things into perspective.
Yeah, and if you're feeling a lot of anxiety at this time, we do have a webinar from last week or 2 weeks ago about handling anxiety with Dr. Gold. So you might want to check that out on our previous live feeds, because I know that that's a big thing for a lot of people right now. There is a lot of things that feel pretty overwhelming. Another question I wanted to ask, just because this is Epilepsy Toronto, so some of the benefits and maybe drawbacks of working from home when you're someone living with epilepsy, which I know, Lindsay, that's something you have dealt with a lot in your lifetime. So
yeah, I mean, it's, again, like, it's nice because you're having seizures, but you're not surrounded by people who are going to be, oh my gosh, what's happening? What do we do? Maybe stressing other people out as much. But at the same time, if you're meeting with them on a conference call or in client care, I mean, I used to be on a lot of phone calls. And so I vividly remember being on a phone call with someone who had called just to ask some questions about our business, and we're chatting away, and I spaced out into one of my typical complex partial seizures for a couple of minutes, and kind of came back. I think I kind of, tried to listen to get a feel for what the heck was just going on. And as I sort of was coming out of that, I said to the client, I'm really sorry, I have epilepsy. So I just had a seizure and I spaced out a little bit. Have no idea what we were just talking about for the last 2 minutes. I'm good though. Just let me know what we were talking about, and we'll get back to the questions so that I can actually help you out. And he was great. He, I think a lot of it comes from how you handle it. And he knew I wasn't worried. So he just sort of, oh my gosh, I'm glad you're okay. And kind of gave me some reminders. And then I think he asked me a few questions too, just getting a little more information. It was it was actually a really good conversation. He kind of always got remembered as one of my favorite people to talk to. Just a cool way that kind of unraveled and happened.
What about the isolation of working from home with seizures? Is that ever an issue for you, or do you have any suggestions on that, either of you?
Yeah, I think eventually it challenged me working from home by myself, because you want to get out, you want to see people, and you can't sometimes, I mean, everyone gets busy with work when you're consistent. You can't just book meetings for the fun of it. So I think to a certain degree there was some challenges, and I don't know, maybe that almost stressed me out more than being somewhere. So I think, I don't know, maybe that was bringing more seizures for me. It's hard to say, right? So I think for me, I hit a point, but I don't know. I think for some people it would be a great way to do it. And I don't know, I don't totally dislike it, but I need a mix.
So one thing that I would add to that is there's ways to add socialization into this, and I can't remember who it was, but I was talking to someone, and over the phone they said, "Do you think we could just have video chat? I really just want to see a face, And I said, "Sure. Here's the Zoom number. Boom, done." So there's also that human connection piece, and I think that's one of the real appeals of video software is we could do all this stuff over phone and email, but it's that kind of human connection that you can just add to it, that you can actually see what a person's facial expression is and so forth. And I know that one of the, for example, my dad, who has epilepsy, he's not been handling the isolation very well. So what he did is that my mom drove him out and parked in front of our house, and they did a whole hey, and of course the kids are sitting there with like the signs and going, "Hey, Daddy, Grandpa." So there's all that, so there's ways to do it without with still keeping that social distancing in mind. But that is an important component. And I think that even it doesn't matter if you're extroverted or introverted, because even introverts, they can be in isolation longer, but they still need that connection, like we all do.
Mm-hmm. And there's just a question about disclosure, and I guess maybe you brought it up a little bit, Lindsay, in your last comment about you disclose to this person on the phone, but how does working from home, how does that affect disclosure issues? Is there any connection to that, or is there any new elements? Or
I think it also depends on how you want to handle it going forward. So because I wanted to open up and tell the person that was what it was, for me, I've always been open to disclosing. So that's never been a question for me, but I know so many people that it's very different. So in that situation, maybe it's figuring out with your boss what will work best, or just connecting with the people that know you. Maybe you're holding back a little bit, or maybe you're paying much more attention to, does this feel like it might be a seizure day? Maybe I don't want to do certain aspects, or I want to cut those back. So it's trying to figure out how it works best for you. But yeah, I think when people maybe don't see you, it's maybe a little more challenging to explain what happened over the phone. And maybe I don't want to leave it. If I'm talking to a client, I don't necessarily want to leave it. But at the same time, everyone's comfort level is so different.
So I'm going to weigh in a little bit on that, and I'm going to put in a plug first, that we actually have a disclosure workshop. So feel free to, and I think we're talking about scheduling another one, but we had one not that long ago. So feel free to email Jessie, Jesse, I forgot how to spell my own name, at epilepsytoronto.org. I'm sure there'll be a link, or
we'll post it in the comments, so you can check that out. And you can also go to our website events calendar. We can put the link for that too, that shows not only the disclosure, but all of the upcoming employment workshops. There's a lot coming every week. Next week, we have one on interviews, I believe it is next week.
Yep.
On Wednesday. So that's one coming up. One more question. I think we have time for one more. I wanted to ask about write-offs and taxes and working from home. What can you tell us about that? Opportunity.
Yeah, we had been talking about this not too long ago as well, that interestingly enough, especially working from home, I think for a certain amount of time throughout the year, you can definitely write stuff off because you're using a certain office space. You are getting things. It depends too if your office is paying for those things, or if you're paying for them and writing them off. And I know to start with, you at least have to there's a form that your work has to sign off on, so that you can write it off with taxes. So that for sure is filling it out and getting it signed off is the first step that I know of. So
Oddly enough, there was an article that just came out about this, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which news outlet.
Globe and Mail. I'm going to post the link for it, so go for it.
So they specifically talked about that. At the end of the day, I know that there's a lot of moving pieces right now, and things have some days changed minute by minute. So exactly how this will play out for next year's tax season, I would say check in with the Canadian Revenue Agency. But generally speaking, it sounds like it is something that you can write off if your company's not already paying for it. So I know there's a whole thing about double dipping and so forth, but there is things that can be done, and that's a conversation to have with your employer, and even to I'm pretty sure Mac just put it in the description.
It was Global News. My apologies, not Global Mail. Global News, but it is in the comments now.
So that's something that you can even forward to your boss and say, hey, yeah, did you know this? And let's have a conversation about it.
There's also the link to that form that you mentioned in the article, Lindsay. So that's a helpful tool.
Oh, they have a link to the form itself. Oh, that's good. That's good.
So I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so the form, and it talks about things like rent and electricity and Wi-Fi, all the things that you could potentially write off during this time of working from home, as well as anything like printers or fax machines or paper that you have to buy that are not compensated from your employer.
So keep your receipts.
You can all use those extra write-offs right now, I think.
Yeah, I think everyone could, for sure. For sure.
Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your insights. I think we got a lot of great things talking. The distraction audit will definitely go on my list of new things I learned. The feed that is below this, it has a lot of helpful tips from people watching, and it continue. If you read this in the future, or if you watch this and you want to add some tips, keep it going, and hopefully it will be a resource for folks. Before we go, I also want to just flag that we have a bunch of stuff going on with Epilepsy Toronto, not just our webinars, which are happening regularly next week. As I mentioned, there's one on medication, epilepsy medication and COVID-19. The following week, we're going to do one on relationship management, which can be a very big issue right now with all this working from home and everyone being at home. But we also have our Mindful Mondays every Monday with Michael Alex, and our Feel Good Fridays, because we all need to feel good a bit. So that's a chance for our members out there to tell us what they're doing and to share what's happening that's making them feel good, and share it with everyone else. So we want you to share, but we also want you to enjoy. So check that out on our feeds, and definitely check in on our website for upcoming Epilepsy Toronto employment workshops, which Jesse and Carter are doing weekly, as well as a Epilepsy Toronto employment group support group, right?
Yep.
That's great. Thank you, Lindsay. Good luck with the working from home.
Thanks as always.
Thank you both for taking the time today. We will see you all next week, hopefully. Take care. Bye. See if I can make this.